Valid, valid, valid. What do you think the relationship between water and cybernetics is?
I'm gonna assume it's something like how technology has controlled water.
Okay. Nice, nice, nice. Just getting everything set up for the stream. It's valid, valid, valid. Boom, we got a streaming link. I'm going to share this all over the social medias, and then we will get started, y'all. Julian, at that point, I will give you the host capabilities so that you can share screen and all of that good stuff. And so for folks who are part of the Zoom, definitely, turn your video on so Julian can see you, because I believe that he has a lot of questions that he's going to be asking throughout the lecture, and also just reading the room to see like who's getting it, who's not, and like how to kind of help move the lecture along. So I'm going to copy the link and we will get started very, very shortly. For those watching the live stream, we are going to get started very soon. Y'all know the drill. I am just sharing all the things on social media so that folks can have access to the link live time. And for folks who did not know, Julian is giving a lecture today, but you will also be seeing him later on today as well, engaging in the pro-demo debate. So we're super excited to see how that shakes down. I think that Julian and Kujwa not only are very smart, but I think are an excellent model for how to be affirmative versus not only a plethora of negative arguments, but I think in terms of cleanliness and just kind of make sensical argumentation are really, really good models for responding to framework. So if you are like, I want to get better at doing that, this is the team, this is the debate to be watching and to be taking copious notes so that you can ask questions for like what was happening in the prep room. But we will start soon. I'm just looking for the post that is about what I posted. There we go. Okay. Or I could just really update the original post. Edit, post. Live stream link. Boom. Save. Post. Ooh, actually, we've got more than 5 students. I lied. Live stream link. Save. All right. So, Julian, I'm going to make you the host, give you the things that you need to lead this, and yeah, y'all take your notes, ask your questions. I'm going to pin you though. All right, you should be the host now.
Awesome. All right, I'll go ahead and get started then. All righty. All right, so nice to see everyone, in the Zoom, hopefully in the live stream. I'm Julian. I debate for USC, going to be senior next year, did some things in debate last year, NDT, CEDA things, hoping to do some more NDT, CEDA things, maybe some round robins this year. But we'll see about that. My lecture today is about cybernetics and water. So cybernetics is my primary research interest in debate. It's sort of an emerging critique in debate because it combines popular race-based arguments like, racial capitalism. It combines some Spiller stuff, maybe some Hartman stuff, that are primarily compartmentalized in economic critiques. So it is a racial capitalism-based critique that can go a lot of different ways. It can be, a race-based critique. It can be a capitalism-based critique. It can be both. In fact, it is strongest when it is both. But, cybernetics, it seems like a very abstract concept at first, seems extremely difficult, but it becomes easier to grasp when it's explained in material examples, explained in terms of the topic. So what I'm hoping today is that I can clear up some misconceptions about cybernetics, and hopefully we can evaluate what cybernetics looks like in terms of this year's topic, which concerns water protection. So in that sense, I've just a couple fairly intuitive key objectives. First one just being to understand the theoretical tenets of cybernetics. So here's where I'll just give a disclaimer that I'm a little bit weak at selecting people because I'm so indecisive. So I would just say, please interrupt to ask questions. Just unmute if you have a question. I'll stop talking. You can just say your piece. Cybernetics is a complex critique. It combines a lot of different critiques, like I was saying. The book that most people read, which is the New World Computer book that just dropped this past year, actually combines a lot of different critiques. It combines Stiegler's sort of Technics critique, combines some Marxist elements. So, it has cat-based critique, combines some Simondon elements, which would be more, metaphysics, how we learn things. So it deals with our cognitive stuff. It also combines the flesh-based critique that Spiller's leverages in some of her books. So it depends on a lot of things. It depends on a lot of, theoretical tact that is somewhat nuanced. But explained in plain terms and with some examples, it becomes a lot more clear. But I just ask that if you have any questions, just feel free to interrupt me at any time. The second key objective would just be to connect this theory to a materialist approach to the topic. So the way I see it, critical affirmatives usually fall in one of two primary camps. There's the debate impact camp, and then there's the more material impact camp, which are usually exemplified by the asset fiat, some sort of Marxism type thing. For instance, the derivative communism approach was a pretty popular approach. Decolonial Marxism is a pretty popular approach. More materialist affirmatives. I found, especially online, that debate impact asks are struggling a little bit. Framework is winning a lot more debates, and people are giving a little bit, more sympathetic decisions to, the fairness / clash-based framework arguments. So the materialist asks has sort of an innovative angle versus framework, which I'll get into later. That means that if we learn how to connect theory to a materialist approach, it can be useful in crafting a strategy that will be, both more successful and offer you a different sort of critique experience than you might be used to. The last key objective is just to construct a viable affirmative and negative strategy. Cybernetics is a critique that can be read on both sides. In my opinion, I actually think cybernetics is a little bit stronger as an AF argument, but you should be able to read both. And a vast majority of my lecture, after I rant for 15 minutes about, these dead French people, will be about talking about affirmative and negative strategies in terms of cybernetics. Which will hopefully result in you being able to apply to those things to the topic and to any affirmative that you might encounter on this topic and also topics in the future. So what is cybernetics is the question that most people have. Cybernetics is based on a litany of different authors, and cybernetics names a sort of abstract field of study. There's no real just one cybernetic studies. It's not Black studies or perhaps gender studies where there's an all encapsulating umbrella. It instead refers to some individual's work which deals with cybernetic concepts. So the first person I want to talk about is the top person. It's Gilbert Simondon, who's, dead French philosopher, the debate goldmine, lived from 1924 to 1989, and is largely regarded as, the inspiration for the field of cybernetics. He's influenced the likes of Bernard Stiegler, influenced Yaqui, influenced Jonathan Beller, some other people like Deleuze, etc. And, it's somewhat intriguing because the critique is titled Cybernetics. Most people, when they see these sort of technics-based critiques, would be like, oh, yeah, that's a critique of cybernetics. But Simondon's work is actually a critique of cybernetics, suggesting that the field of cybernetic study has an analytical gap. So what Simondon sought to do is sort of fill in that gap and rework the field of cybernetics to more accurately name some developing realities in the 20th and 21st century. So Simondon's theory is a little bit complex and abstract until it is applied. All you really need to know about Simondon is that he suggested this idea of individuation. So individuation is very, very popular, debate argument in terms of like academy-based critiques versus critical asks. The most common, my bad. I think that might have been my internet. TLDR is that cybernetics is not really just like one field. Rather, it names the practices that these authors have critiqued in individual books that study paradigms of technics, which I will explain in a little bit. And also, my internet is being a little bit sus. So if I cut out, Pete, please feel free to just hit the chat, and I'll just repeat what I said. But TLDR, this Simondon thing, is based around the idea of individuation. The author that I most commonly think of when I think of individuation is actually, Moten, who talks about individuation in terms of logistics, in terms of policy and planning. But Simondon's idea of individuation is an idea of individuation as something that we are produced by and reproduced. So the idea is that the material is shaped by the semiotic. What does that mean? Because, it's a little bit word salad. It just means that how we describe things and understand things in our head influences and is influenced by our material environment. In this sense, individuation is something that occurs when an individual is isolated from the collective or understood in relation to that broader collective. The easiest example is the assembly line. A worker is a part of a broader collective of workers. However, the perception of individuals who are workers are based on their individual capacity. Are they productive? Are they efficient? Do they enjoy their job? Which in doing so, and evaluating each of these individuals as individual folks creates a template of ideal being that all individuals within that collective are contrasted to. So people take for granted concepts like productivity being good, which then becomes a template for that broader collective. All workers should aspire to be productive. All workers should aspire to be efficient. But then those workers are evaluated individually, and they are pathologized relative to those larger collectives if they fail to meet those concepts. Easy example of this would be in terms of the welfare queen. So this relies on the template that individuals should be responsible for their own financial well-being. The pathologization of Black women in terms of the welfare queen stereotype is based on this myth that Black women are lazy or are dependent on the federal government, which contrasts individual Black women within this larger template of an ideal productive worker. So Simon Don's, individuation critique is somewhat abstracted from technology, but the only real thing that you need to get out of it is just that individuation is a process that happens in our head, and is a process of comparing and contrasting individuals within a larger collective. Which leads me to the old, Bernie 2021, Bernard Stiegler. This guy is very complicated. I'd probably not recommend reading primary source Stiegler in a debate. He is cool because his work is immensely important to the field. He's really good friends with people like Yaqui, who actually eulogized him when he died this past year. And his idea of technics is the heart of a lot of the literature. However, he's also like, France is bad because the nuclear family has been eroded. So, the queerness critique of the old Stiegs is like ripping. I would probably not, just read some Stiegler cards because you're just begging to lose to the, homophobic critique. There are a couple extremely important ideas that Stiegler has, however, that I want to discuss because, like many philosophers, although they are problematic faves, their ideas inspire a lot of other analytical concepts. The first comes from his series of books called Mere Croyance et Discrédit, which is just disbelief and discredit. It is a series about how industrial production has changed the psyche. Stiegler couches this critique in the paradigm of work and capital accumulation, destroying what he calls our spirit, our collective spirit. What he means by that is just our reliance on technology, our reliance on production and the assembly line has eroded the sustainable and notably the plural ways of living, i.e. different ways of living instead of just one template of being that arose prior to capitalism in favor of one monolithic system of production that is seen as globally beneficial and necessary to be integrated into. This is sort of an abstract concept, easily exemplified in terms of local versus international economy. Before, the rise of industrial capitalism, communities produced for their locality. They produced simply what was necessary to sustain, say, their small town or sustain their individual family. However, given the rise of industrial production, individuals are increasingly incentivized to produce for the broader collective, the international environment, and thus one system of production that emphasizes rampant resource overconsumption, emphasizes things like competition and market, the financialization of everyday life, is something that is necessary, which sort of has devalued those forms of local living because they are seen as inefficient, and they are seen as not productive enough. This sets up the basis for a very strong sort of Heideggerian critique of overconsumption, using the rationale that as we are integrated into systems of capital, we internalize the logics that undergird capital as something that we need and we cannot live without, which, returning to these ideas that I'll constantly use, throughout the lecture, is just, we need to be productive. We need to be efficient. The other more important idea that Stiegler has for the cybernetics critique is the idea of technics. It is from his series of volumes, La Technique et le Temps, which is just technics and time. One big mistake that people make, however, and we were even talking about this before the Zoom, is that some people confuse technics for technology when they are similar but not necessarily the same. So the first question that I wanted to pose, to the group of the people is, does anybody know what the difference is between technics and technology? And feel free to just unmute and shoot.
Is technics kind of how the technology interacts with each other, while technology is kind of the I guess the machines themselves?
Yeah, that's one certainly one way of looking at it. So I think what you're gesturing towards is technology is just the material apparatus, like our phone, our computer, etc. Whereas technics names sort of interpersonal logics that are produced by that technology. Is that, like a fairly accurate? Yeah, and I would say that's like a pretty accurate read of the distinction. Does anybody else want to jump in before I just, continue speaking in line with that idea? Awesome. So yeah, I would say that's, pretty accurate account. So the definition that I'll probably use, the working definition, is that technics refers to the condition of thought, and technology refers to what that condition of thought valorizes and produces. So technics is just the paradigm that explains why we like technology. Technics basically names the productive condition of liberal individualism where thinking in numbers is seen as something that is necessary for life and becomes functionally an unconscious project because it affects our memory and thus our perception. Stiegler is big on this idea of memory influencing the future. And given that these processes are unconscious, it becomes something that we will ourselves to do, and thus devalue others based on those internalized concepts. So what does it mean, to think in numbers? It just means that everything is rendered calculable. And what does that look like? Well, the hours in the day become vehicles for measuring how much work you can get done. You're not like, well, I have all this time. You're like, well, I have just enough time to, finish this assignment for class, go to work, accomplish all these tasks for my job or school, etc. Another example is financial risks, like making a loan, become predicated on predictions of whether people will pay you back, which is, the existence of the credit score is like one great example that a number, is assigned to you based on the likelihood that you'll actually be able to repay your loan. And if you are deemed somebody that is unlikely to repay your loan, then you actually are barred from receiving loans. So you're barred from entry into the financial market. So technics is just the thought process. And we like technology because it patches those gaps in human cognitive and physical ability. Where humans are less productive or less efficient, machines are seen as the most optimal. They are seen as something that can fix those gaps that we have because of our human limits, like needing to sleep, needing to breathe, in complex like underwater or air environments, stuff like that. So question in the chat is technics kind of going along with the idea of numbers being the most optimal method? Certainly. Numbers in the sense that, numbers are what is plugged in to make calculation, and also just thinking in numbers as an abstract concept, just, a calculative paradigm in general. And I think, these concepts are a little bit, abstract, right? I'm like trying to use some examples, but I think they'll be a lot clearer when I explain them in terms of like the topic. It'll like be easier to ground the idea of thinking in numbers. Speaking of which, Beller in the world computer is the one who like uses the term thinking in numbers that has like helped me conceptualize what a lot of the field is like. So the world computer, derivative conditions of racial capitalism is my favorite cybernetics text. It's a text we read last year, at the NDT. And, very cool argument. The world computer is probably the one with the most high quality evidence on all of these concepts. The idea of the world computer names the integration of technics into a paradigm that Beller calls computational racial capitalism. Beller being Jonathan Beller, who is a professor, wherein capital accumulation becomes a cause and effect of information. That information is plugged into racialized predictive algorithms that inform what's called a derivative condition. That derivative condition functionally just means people are able to derive somebody's lived reality and thus their future and past action based on the data that is collected about them or that they give to other people. So what are some examples of like this derivative condition? Because, derivative condition is like financial derivatives. Derivative is like a advanced math concept. I wouldn't really know too much because I don't take math classes because I'm not that smart. But derivatives, I'm pretty sure, like big thing in math. TLDR, the best example is predictive policing. Not only are companies that collect, I can re-explain the derivative concept. The derivative concept sounds a lot more complex than it is. It's basically just you are able to tell who somebody is, who they have been, and who they will be based on their personal characteristics or information about them. An example, returning to this idea of the welfare queen stereotype, is that if somebody were to script the welfare queen stereotype onto somebody, they would be like, all right, well, in the past, they have been lazy. They have not been working. That is why they need government assistance. In the future, they will continue to do so. So using that as a justification that they will continue to not work, the consequence is thus that people believe that they should be barred from receiving welfare, or people believe that these are innately bad people because of their inability to work. So the derivative concept is basically just you are able to you're able to predict how people will continue to work or how people will continue to be. An easy example of this like derivative concept is predictive policing. So not only are companies that collect information like ShotSpotter able to profit off of selling and analyzing information. ShotSpotter is a predictive policing technology that measures the amount of bullets and where those bullet trajectories go in certain neighborhoods. So that sees information as something that is neutral, sees information and surveillance as good because they are a means of accumulating wealth. But then that data is also something that is seen as objective and thus incapable of racial implications, which is the means by which the 21st century has used ideas of technology, ideas of artificial intelligence, algorithms, etc., to justify the necessity of things like policing changes. So it changes, the narrative of policing changes from just, the out and out racist, we need to police Black neighborhoods because that's where Black people live, to we need to increase police where there is more crime, which, as we know in debate and as we know as people who have thought about race critically for more than probably 35 seconds, where there is more crime has a racialized connotation. However, ShotSpotter and companies that sell information use their data as an objective force. They are like, there are more gunshots in this neighborhood, thus we need to deploy more troops or more police. Well, police troops can be one and the same, given that the police are militarized. But in doing so, that obviously ignores the material realities that create crime and the uneven distribution of predictive technology to those areas in order to justify policing in the first place. What do I mean? ShotSpotter obviously is not going into gated white communities and being like, all right, well, let's see how many gunshots there are in, I guess like Lake Quivira is the example that comes to mind because that's like right next to my house. They are, deployed disproportionately to Black neighborhoods. Then if there's a gunshot that is collected on that information, they can sell that data to the police. The police can be like, objectively, there are more, deaths here. So we need to increase the police force. So that was a lot of information. That was like 20 minutes of like straight cybernetics ranting. So I want to open up the floor for a couple questions. If people have those before I just continue talking about cybernetics in terms of the topic. Awesome. Oh, yeah. 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 So the reason I'm laughing is because somebody's typed in the chat. It is so complicated. And like, yeah, honestly, it is pretty complicated. I don't think I really help because like I use like a lot of a lot of big words, but hopefully the examples are helping somewhat. And it is complicated, but then when you apply it in terms of a material reality, so I think like one of the more helpful examples has been like the welfare queen example. Like that's mostly when I see people nodding and being like, okay, that makes sense. So I'll try to do that in terms of water. Like the first idea is like virtual water, which I think is like, I'll explain it in terms of like a litany of ways it connects to computation, and hopefully that will help. But yeah, it is very complicated, mostly because it combines a lot of critiques. It's not like a simple neolib K where you're just like, Af likes the economy, extinction because warming. You have to be like, well, Af likes the economy, extinction because warming, but also it's racist because X, and also it's, carries all of these assumptions about information that, neutralize information. So it's a little bit complex, but once you get into it, it's like pretty easy. And it's less complex than a lot of other critiques, in my opinion. So yeah, I'll continue. Feel free to interrupt if we have further questions. Okay, so I want to talk about cybernetics in terms of the topic. So the first, notable result that comes up when you search, cybernetics, water protection stuff, this idea of virtual water, which is also, I guess, what was in the disclaimer for this lecture. Virtual water simply refers to the water that is invested into products. So the graphic makes it like extremely simple. I actually stared at my screen for like 30 minutes trying to understand what these words meant because, I don't really know a lot of things. But then I saw this graphic and I was like, oh my God, this makes it so simple. It was pioneered by a British geographer named Anthony Allan, which is like, more relevant. He saw it as a solution to growing water inequality. Basically, the idea of virtual water is just companies can import water, or countries, countries and companies can sometimes be the same thing, which we'll get into, but that's none of my business. Countries can import water-intensive goods, which means that they are functionally importing water because they otherwise would not have the capacity to produce the goods. So Anthony Allan saw this as a solution to countries that are lacking in water. And he was like, well, the easiest way that these countries can just make up for not having water is just by importing the water in the form of a good. So an example is like, I don't really know what the unit of measurement is that is like used in this graphic, but say, you need 650 like liters of water to produce like one, pack, I guess, of barley. Importing that barley saves that amount of water in the country. So virtual water just refers to the amount of water that is necessary to produce a product. So this idea of virtual water became extremely, extremely popular. It won Anthony Allan a litany of scientific achievement awards because it was viewed as this like very ethical solution to growing inequality between the global north and the global south. However, obviously, the idea of virtual water relies on some neoliberal tenets that feed computational racial capitalism. The first of which, it sees economic exchange as something that is beneficial. This is like, and hopefully in terms of explaining a litany of different ways, you can see the different angles that this critique can take so that it's not just a neolib or race K, but can combine a lot of these. The first of which is just the simple neolib K. They say economics good, we say economics bad. Allan says that virtual water is good because it produces trade interdependence that decreases the likelihood of conflict. The rationale being that if countries are sharing resources, they are less likely to go to war. This is, a neoliberal myth that naturalizes the idea that economic exchange is neutral or even beneficial in governance. Even though it seems beneficial at first, the idea that interdependence would produce conflict, that sees trade as something that is inevitable, sees free markets as something that should be mapped onto international relations, i.e. the idea that although we are located at different parts of the globe, that we should be exchanging goods with each other. So a problem that is created by money, inequality, and the conditions of inequality in those nations are produced through colonialism, which was to extract, resources for the purpose of accumulating more money. The solution to that economic inequality is simply circulate more money. We need more economy to fix the economy problem instead of abolishing money in the first place. So it's sort of a redundant neoliberal solution. Second tenet is virtuality is beneficial. The idea is that virtual water started as a concept, but is only possible because of technological advancements in computing. So virtual water, it's obviously difficult to just be like, all right, well, you need 650 liters to, make this barley. Like, how do you determine that? Like, how do you just know that? The reason we do is because of computers. Algorithms predict which nations need to import. How much water is available to each nation is determined by those same algorithms. And the ideal price for imports is based on speculative risk assessment. It is based on whether, it is based on predicted losses in those products, et cetera, which, naturalizes algorithms, naturalizes those predictive paradigms as something that is beneficial, which, seems innocuous at first. Predictions aren't always bad if they are used for reducing inequality. But in sort of normalizing this idea of algorithms as something that can be objective or even beneficial, it results in them not being questioned elsewhere. So people are like, well, algorithms have been useful for virtual water, so why do we really care if they're used in drones? Or why do we really care if they're used to predict healthcare scores, like whether or not people should be able to access the doctor, et cetera, which I'll get into in a little bit, talking more about this sort of predictive policing impact. The third fundamentally neoliberal tenet that virtual water relies on is commodity exchange. Anthony Allan had this like cute little thing where he was like, we should see water as liquid capital, which liquid capital. Oh my God, it's water. It's so funny. But also that transmutes water from something that just exists. It's a resource that occurs in our natural environment to something that is imbued with financial property. Water becomes less of just water that you see. Rather, it becomes a vehicle of profit. There is value attached to the water. Price, meaning that water is something that can be owned and exchanged instead of just let be. So obviously this feeds a sort of overconsumption type argument that countries and companies would have an incentive to consume a lot of water, to export a lot of products to the global south to fix the water imbalance. But really, it just results in water being consumed at rapid rates, which feeds, pollution, feeds some like worker exploitation style impacts. But also, if you think about it, who really determines what the appropriate price is? It is determined by the person making the algorithm, and I'll answer this question in a second. It is determined by the person making the algorithm. Usually people in the global north determine those. So optimal trade value can be rewired to be beneficial to the north and not beneficial to the south. One question that I received in the chat is, if water is considered liquid capital, wouldn't that be an easy link with cap? Yes, like 100. The liquid capital thing, so this commodity exchange thing, the economic exchange beneficial thing, are where I would couch the sort of neolib cap style critique of cybernetics. The virtuality beneficial and subpoint I'm about to explain, which is about borders, are where sort of racialized aspects come in, which I think demonstrates the idea that this critique is like can be modular. It can refer to a lot of different things. So the last idea is just the idea of borders. Certain authors, namely Benjamin Bratton, who we'll talk about later, take issue with the state formation because they say it masks the infiltration of foreign policy by high-class elites. So it misses the boat on state power. If you think about it, virtual water just takes for granted that countries exist and that countries should exist because instead of just, distributing water, it says that certain countries, certain localities deserve certain amounts of water, that they should be places should be distinct, and also that we should have an international marketplace. So in seeing places as distinct and creating borders, you create boundaries that need to be enforced, which is why we have stuff like border patrol. You know, there's not free flow of bodies, there's not free flow of people between, say, the United States and Mexico. Rather, the boundary, the physical, the physical threshold of the United States is something that is enforced with surveillance, is enforced with, militarized police formations, enforced by weapons, etc. So those boundaries and the maintenance of those boundaries carries racialized implications and normalizes information collection technology as something that can be used and is good. So when you think of border patrol, the number one thing I think of is biometric surveillance. The fact that they check, individual bodies within the car. They have, the screening stuff at like the TSA that you have to go through. But also surveillance drones, which are used to track immigration, surveillance towers, which exist at the border, etc. All these things, all those surveillance technologies are deemed necessary to police boundaries, which is the sort of racialized borders critique that cybernetics has in terms of sovereignty, which I'll discuss in a little bit. So the virtual water one is like the number one critique that I found that makes sense. However, it can be a little bit difficult because virtual water isn't just like an idea that the United States uses, so it might get into alt cause problems. But a lot of these apps bite extra T and just exploit their way out of it. So I'll get into that in a little bit. Some other angles are economics and governance. So one of the easiest ways to explain the relevance of cybernetics is in terms of the topic is thinking of cybernetics like a basic racial capitalism critique. In this sense, it becomes easy to generate links to economic logics that the topic exemplifies or that apps do. An easy way to conceptualize this is in terms of status quo water governance. So the easiest example that I found is like the EPA. So the EPA issues permits to companies that are like, you can pollute this certain amount. We have said that you can pollute this certain amount. If you pollute more than that, we will sue you. If you stay within this optimal social cost, then you're fine. That is a neoliberal idea. One, because it sees the economy as an inevitability. Social cost is not determined based on its true environmental impact. It is based on how much environmental impact is deemed a worthy trade-off for economic production that would otherwise be sacrificed by water protection. So it is not based on environmental impact just by itself. It is based on environmental impact relative to economic blowback. So it uses a sort of commodity exchange marketization logic that sees the economy as an inevitability, and then can become an easy link to the apps that are like, well, we need to protect water to solve economy based impact. Well, that obviously sees water as a commodity to be protected to sustain the global economy, which is like a very self-explanatory neolib K. The only other way that I think cybernetics is like easily exemplified is sovereignty logic. In my mind, this is the link with the weakest impact. Like you could be like, well, water protection zones, they have boundaries that are policed. Like easy examples like No Dapple, wherein protesters were like sprayed with like freezing cold water and like arrested continually. But I think it's like a little bit self-explanatory, just the idea that states are the ones deemed with the power to determine where and what water should be protected. So it sort of connects to that nation state borderization logic that I was talking about earlier, because the people who are able to maintain borders are the people who are the countries who are deemed powerful. So it sort of gets into international relations critique territory. Another way of conceptualizing this could be a blue-collar crime link. This is like, you know, like a USC classic. Like, I actually watched some debates where this occurred on the warming topic, and it sort of makes sense. It's simple reverse pit of doom, wherein the AF has something, you know, has some sort of penalty on private actors if they pollute to a certain amount. You simply ask, how is that enforced? They're like, well, suing. Obviously, they have to say the companies get sued. Then you can just be like, well, why is suing good? Like, why should we sue companies? Why should there be criminal penalties? The simple reason is that it's the flip side of stuff like hate crimes legislation. Yeah, we don't want hate crimes, but how are hate crimes legislation enforced? Well, the police, they arrest you if they commit a hate crime, which sort of neutralizes the idea of the police as something that is objectively beneficial. It's the same way for blue-collar crime. You would think polluters should be punished, right? But should they be punished with the, you know, the prison industrial complex? Should they be punished with the same logic that clears mass incarceration? Probably not, because mass incarceration is bad. So the sovereignty logic can be exemplified in terms of a simple, you know, your idea that criminal penalties are good feeds a racist system of mass incarceration link argument. The debate impact of cybernetics is very weak. Very many of these cybernetics apps, you would want a more materialist approach. But the cybernetics apps are good versus the debate impact, because a lot of the arguments that more performance-based teams would make on the neg are deemed inevitable by the cybernetics uniqueness arguments. So example is like, they read like a blackness-based critique of your affirmative, and they're like, you know, increase anti-blackness in this venue. Well, you have a strong uniqueness argument that anti-blackness as a condition of the world is inevitable under a system of computational racial capitalism, because, and then you can just insert all the, you know, sort of financialized accounts of blackness that create that condition. In my mind, cybernetics is weakest versus framework. Still working on the best angle for that, you know, because you would think about cybernetics constantly. But it doesn't really impact turn framework that well. It sort of internally turns it, which I'll talk about in a second. So the vast majority of the like ranting component of this lecture is complete. I'm probably going to spend about 20 more minutes talking about, you know, strategy on both sides, and I'll probably ask less questions just for the sake of time. But I wanted to first discuss cybernetics on the negative. So the first thing that you have to keep in mind is a link argument. And the easiest route to victory would obviously be a link to the plan. The reason being just because it's unlikely that individuals can win a framework argument that contests your critique if you have a link to the plan. However, the plan would have to be so specific. It would just have to be like, you know, we should increase surveillance to protect water for you to have a link to the plan. So you're probably not going to have that. Instead, you should have a link to the advantage concept. Examples include the ones that I've explained earlier. Protecting water to serve the global economy, which gets into virtual water territory. If the AF is like EPA permits, that has the commodity status link argument that I was talking about earlier. Those advantage concepts can be spun easily as links to the plan. Sometimes people will even include terms of art like Environmental Protection Agency or, you know, this permits thing in their plan. And those are, you know, links to the action of the plan, if not the plan text itself. So easy link argument. Other examples include links to the advantage area. So a common, you know, AF that people read versus case is like the sort of hegemony style AF that says like China or Russia is revisionist. There are a couple like obvious critiques that would be based in computational racial capitalism territory. One is like a sort of Western logic based critique that some states' violence is justified and in others it is pathologized. So instead of seeing technology as something that is just bad, we see technology as something that is bad if it is misused. This is easiest exemplified in terms of China, Russia worse, which is like an extremely popular argument. that people are like, hegemony might be bad, but if China and Russia had it, it would be worse because they surveil. Like, really? Like, that's like the most pre-K argument ever. Obviously, the United States does the exact same thing, if not worse, right? But that idea of China, Russia misusing technology, and that's the reason technology is bad, sort of neutralizes technology as something that can be good when it's used in good hands. Who are those good hands? The West, the United States, etc. The other is just a predictions K. It's the simple security K. Attempting to predict things in international relations fails. The international environment is too complex to predict things. People are wrong. People say, you know, there's going to be a Russia war this year. There's going to be a China war this year. We're all going to die from artificial intelligence by 2025, etc. But those predictions often come wrong. This is, I think, best used as defense. I don't think it's really great offensively, but you can read easy predictions Ks on the case. The one thing that I would suggest shying away from with the cybernetics critique is the magnitude link. I think Ks oftentimes struggle to beat extinction-based Fs because of extinction first. One way that I've proposed in the past to dealing with this is just reading a link that is like extinction first framing bad, which, you know, pretty easy with this critique. A lot of the reasons why extinction first framing is something that is deemed good is, you know, because you can produce change in the future, which is, you know, valuing life for its productive capacity. But I think this K gets such good impacts that you really don't need a magnitude link. Instead, you should just have a framework argument that is like representations matter in the slightest. The one question I'll probably ask for the rest of the lecture deals with this impact debate question. So I was wondering what you all think are some impacts that cybernetics critiques would have. I'll give it like 5 and then I'll move on. I explained one, which is this predictive policing thing, so I probably won't, you know, repeat myself too much on that. There is a couple things in the chat. A sheep mentality impact that people think the same, definitely. So sort of connected to racialized impacts. AI taking over, definitely. I think that AI taking over one is the second impact that I want to talk about. The sheep mentality mindset and the predictions, yeah. So those two things, the people think the same and the predicting the future stuff are the predictions K. And if you think about it, that predictions K feeds the predictive policing impact, which is largely explained above. Surveillance that predicts the future is deemed something that is beneficial. Normalizes things like biometric surveillance, normalizes things like, you know, border protection, et cetera. The two other impacts that I think are really good is a climate impact. It's a neolib K. It, like, simply put, it is a cap K. So easiest thing is just DDEV. It's like the global economy is bad. We should not trade information because that feeds a system of economic exchange that rampantly overconsumes resources because of competition. Because companies compete with each other, you're incentivized to innovate rapidly. To do so, you need to consume mass amounts of resources, which pollutes the environment and generates global warming. So you can easily read cards from like any of these books that are like warming by 2030. Then you have a fast, high magnitude impact. Other impact that gets a lot of traction and is so true is virtuous war. The idea that technology makes war more likely. The rationale being wars are hard to justify to the public. You don't want to tell the public that you're sending their children to go die overseas. So most people, you know, would not support a war, especially in the 21st century. But if that war is being fought with robots, it's very easy to justify to the public. There's no domestic human cost. We need to get into this war to prevent a future conflict, but it's fine because we're just sending robots, right? There's no domestic human cost. There's no boots on the ground. That increases the likelihood that war will happen because it means that more missions are deemed something that is possible and thus necessary. What do I mean by this? Well, obviously humans cannot, surveil cannot fly. So drones take the place of humans and are viewed as something that is beneficial to prevent war. So it leads to what's called mission creep, which is just expanding the scope of missions beyond what they were originally posited as necessary for. And that increased the likelihood of conflict. So that's the impact debate. Choosing an alternative, I'll probably talk less about the alternatives and like specifically, specific theories, because that depends on the author. So during the question section, I'll probably take questions about that. But the easiest thing to do in conceptualizing an alternative is that you need one that is both material and conceptual. You need a solution that deals with the material reality of technology. So you need something that dislodges the international marketplace, like a communism style. But you also need it to be conceptual, because a lot of the problem of cybernetics is about how we think, how we know things, what we value. We want productivity because that is something we have deemed in our heads as something that is necessary. So stuff like the cognitive general strike, which is Beller's alternative, which is basically like do a general strike, so you institute literal communism, but also decolonize language. So we stop valuing concepts like productivity, efficiency, etc. So you need one that resolves both of those link arguments. The rationale being that you won't always just win a material link, like, they increase technology equals overconsumption. Sometimes your link will be their research is, computation based. You'll win a reps link. And in that sense, you would want a sort of conceptual alternative as opposed to a material one. When should you read this? Well, obviously, if the AF says the economy or technology is important, if the AF is based on Western irrationality, it's just like it's easily slotted in the exact same way that the neolib K is slotted in. I'd also say you could read it if people are not expecting it. It's a critique that requires a lot of back files to answer, because the impact arguments you usually would need carded answers to. You need no virtuous war, you need no climate, you need tech good, etc. So if people are not prepared to debate that argument, say you don't usually go for the critique, it is unlikely that they will just like have cybernetics, your flavor of cybernetics blocked out. So I think that it can have some utility, which leads me to this, quick slide about the utility of the cybernetics critique. I think it is a good critique for a couple reasons. One is that it outweighs and turns the case. Virtuous war, this impact argument can be something that is outside of the debate. It can be an external impact, which is usually leveraged against stuff like soft left AFs. But if you think about it, if the AF has a war advantage, you easily turn that war advantage. There was a question that is like, is this interchangeable with CAP? Usually, yeah. I think it makes all the same CAP arguments, but has easily conceptualized impact arguments as well. It can be more expansive. Not in KF debates, in my opinion. But there are some cybernetics links to KFs, which largely deal with like historical memory and stuff, but those are so like theoretically abstract. And in my opinion, it's just like the no internal link argument is just like ripping those critiques to shreds. It's just like, really? Because like the impacts are so material. It's like global economy, like surveillance and stuff like that. But the KF team just being like, really? Like you think we create more border towers? It's like sort of like an intuitive no internal link argument. Outweighs in terms of case, however, is utilitist because you have a warming impact, which is the best impact in debate, in my opinion. It is obviously slower, but you can speed it up by reading a card about that says that it happens by 2030. You can speed it up by saying that there are short-term effects. So there's, increasing wildfires, which causes social instability. Ocean acidification is rapidly increasing. Sea level rise destroys coastal economies, all these like extreme weather events, etc. So you can speed up your impact argument. So outweighs in terms of the case means that you're always in a good angle versus extinction-based asks because you don't have to deal with extinction first. The cybernetics critique applies to a lot of stuff. It applies to any situation in which a neolib K would be read. It applies to any situation in which a security K would be read. And it destroys asks that say technology is good. And sometimes the alternative solves the case. There are two notable examples. One is if the app has a climate advantage, obviously, if you win the tenets of like your DDEV style impact argument, then you're in a good spot on getting rid of computational racial capitalism, gets rid of the logic that justifies warming. But also, the alternative can solve wars as well. If there were not nation states, there would be no incentive for nation states to go to war. So conflicts that are based on, like border logic, like say like an India-Pakistan war, it'd be unlikely that those wars would escalate in the world of an alternative. And this prices in a lot of the strategic AF moves that they can make. So if they impact turn, you can just dump a litany of cards because there's a lot of great impacts to this, like cyber war, like the virtuous war stuff, climate stuff. If they say alt fails, you can just go pivot for a framework argument. Most of the cards that people read are just like generically like tech is something that we need. We can't get rid of tech. They're like ad hom, like, these people who like cybernetics are like Luddites, which are like, anti-tech people, I guess is like the most simple. So they're like ad homs. They're not really good cards. And the other thing is just like a lot of people will just say extinction first and just sit on extinction first and framework. If they do that, you can just double down on your framework argument. It's like, yeah, you get to weigh the case. But in exchange for you getting to weigh the case, we also get links to your reps. And it's a reciprocal trade because you now get to, weigh your impacts against our impacts. Which sounds dangerous, for most critiques, but you should keep in mind that you have material impacts, like you have extinction impacts. So you're always in a good spot if they can weigh the case, because you not only turn the case, but likely outweigh it. So really quickly, I want to talk about constructing a cybernetics affirmative. The theory of power component, I've explained a little bit in terms of this world computer idea. Which I think is like really the only theory of power that would make sense on this topic. If people have questions about others, they can feel free to ask me about that. There's a litany of links to the topic, which I've gotten into, the virtual water and sovereignty stuff, but also ideas about speculative risk assessment, I think, is something else that, could be seen as something that is beneficial, like which communities are deserving of water. Which can easily be conceptualized in, sort of the Flint affirmative. So cybernetics is basically just like in individualism, neolib style K. The justification for this Flint thing is like, well, Flint is not deserving of water. They can't fix their pipes because they're a low income community. Like it's what they deserve for being poor and black. So these ideas of risk assessment, the ideas of which communities are deserving and need water, are one, determined by sovereigns. So it links to the sovereign link, but also those are connected to, racialized assumptions about productivity, racialized assumptions about those communities' involvement in the economy. So a lot of these like smaller water protection affirmatives that are going to be very popular can be explained with a cybernetic angle. These apps have a lot of tricks. The no states equal, and what Jasmine's saying in the chat about like being poor and black is like a particular type of treatment and service gets into the economics and governance thing that I was talking about earlier. So which communities are a legislative priority is determined by those communities' predicted value to the global economy and to other people. These apps have a lot of tricks. There is, the no states equal no incentive to go to war thing. There's the climate thing. Some of these apps are read with plan text and have alternative normal means arguments. The simplest way to explain this normal means argument is just that you can explain normal means as a cause and effect of what's called conditional probability, which I won't spend too long on this argument because it's like probably going to fall out of favor in the coming years and is like sort of hit or miss because it's based on people's opinions about normal means. But you can like very easily just say, that the only logical way that the United States federal government would take the plan's action is if there were to be derivative communism. And then you can use that as the justification for just fiating communism into existence, which I'll take questions about. It's like a little bit abstract concept. But one thing to keep in mind is that you need to consider the 1 and C. You will not have to deal with the cat K. Like nobody in the right mind would read cat versus cybernetics because you just basically destroy it. But that makes framework more difficult. It means that you have to write two ACs to DAs. It means that you have to write two ACs to PICs and, PICs with a K. It means that you have to write two ACs to impact turns. So something I found that is beneficial is having a shorter 2AC overview, which means that you can get into the line by line a lot faster. And the critiques of these sort of apps are very weak as well. So you mostly deal with like very policy-based strategies. The reason the Ks are weak is because most of them are just solvency-based. They're just like, this app fails to solve warming. Congrats. You have a solvency deficit to the advantage. That is not offense. None of my business. 2AC and beyond is something I'll talk about really quickly and then give questions. So you need to obviously write blocks. You need a 2AC format for each argument. The 2AC format that I use and that most teams employ is versus DAs. You have first a case turns the DA argument. Then you have a reps critique of the DA. So an example is like the Japan DA last year, we read a card that like fears of proliferation or like anti-Asian infantilization. You would put your reps K there. Third would be a defensive argument about predictions failing. So it's sort of in line with the F's predictions fail. You would want specific defense. Yeah, I can explain the reps K thing. And you would want a critique of the DA. So say they said like economy DA, you would want like, a critique of the economy, stuff like that. And then you would want impact defense. The reps K idea is just a critique of the research that the disadvantage uses. As opposed to like the disadvantage itself. So, and a reps K could be like, they have this, racist idea about the likelihood of, I'll just explain this anti-Asian infantilization thing. So like people would say Japan is going to proliferate nuclear weapons. They're going to build nukes and thus cause global instability. We would be like, that is racist. That obviously, is not something that you would say about another nation, because the United States and Soviet Union both built nukes and the world didn't end. So it's based in this logic that, it is uniquely Asian actors that would contribute to instability. And also it utilizes historical caricatures of Asian folks as incapable of managing themselves. It's like, if they get nukes, they'll just have to use them, or they'll just, everybody in Asia will just also start just randomly building nukes for no reason. So it is based on sort of racist Western assumptions. It's the reps K. The 2AC to the format to the counterplan for writing blocks is just like do both, do the counterplan, the solvency deficit, and links to net benefit. It's like very simple. Debating framework is really the thing that you need to think about. The 2AC to this is usually counter-interpretation based as opposed to impact turn based. So the way that cybernetics beats framework is usually winning a critique of the USFG being three branches as something that is unpredictable or something that is, a neoliberal legal formalist assumption, which turns their internal link. So it means that you don't really have to deal with fairness or clash, because the way that they get to fairness and clash is through predictable limits. And you are saying that their limits are unpredictable, or you're saying that their limits are bad for debate. So you have, minimal offense that impact turns, but your internal link turn is strong. And you can get out on some ticky-tack distinctions like plain text in a vacuum, counter-interpretation shields, there's no impact to skills, etc. Thinking about the DA versus the case, the DAs are usually fast. They'll usually just be like, if there was no surveillance, there would be a war. That is quick. But the case is certain. So time frame versus magnitude distinction. You could read cards that speed up this time frame distinction, like I've said, and you need a go-to trick to debate DAs. The easiest one I found is just reading add-ons. Say, you say computerization causes cyber war. It is increasingly likely that as we exchange information in the global age and wars are fought via computers, that there will be cyber conflict wherein somebody hacks our nukes or they spoof our nukes so they make us think like we've been nuked, and thus we have an incentive to launch nuclear weapons, etc. And you should just debate the DA like you're reading a policy app. Last is just like, can we still permute critiques? Yes, especially against things like CAP. You have good permutation arguments. The permutation can usually be couched in terms of this inevitability idea that I talked about earlier. The idea that, well, anti-blackness is inevitable under computational racial capitalism. So prefer the AF as like, the materialist corrective, and the alternative is the pedagogical corrective. It's like an easy way of explaining the permutation. So really, that's all I have. This is the practice activity that we'll do at some point. It's just giving an overview and link explanation versus the packet F, using some of the concepts that I talked about. But that is something we'll talk about at some point and do later. I'll stop sharing screen and take questions now. And I'll send it out.
Before questions start, I will end the live here. So thanks y'all for folks who watched or who are going to watch. This was an excellent lecture, both in terms of content and strategies. So thank you so much, Julian. You may have given a cheat code to some people for their preparation for the season. So yes, thanks y'all. Oh, can you make the host real quick? So that
Thank you.
Can you, I can end the stream and tell the host.
You should be the host now.
Thank you.
Of course, y'all stay on.